the best militaries, for example, in the U.S., UK, many of our NATO allies and other countries around the world are trained at the heart to be peace builders. And really they are used in that way oftentimes during times of peace for engagement.
The United States military interventions in the Middle East and the British military intervention in the Middle East, we have it on record now that before those interventions, military interventions were signed off. There was huge... there were meetings about to establish how much oil was available in Iraq and how it would be divvied up after the war.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Sherri Goodman. Sherri is the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security and the first ever Deputy Undersecretary of Defence Environmental Security. She serves as chair on the board at the Council on Strategic Risks, is a senior strategist at the Centre for Climate and Security, a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre's Polar Institute, is vice chair of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, and the author of Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. Threat multiplier is probably a term that you've heard, but Sherri was the woman who coined it, having pushed for research on the national security implications of climate change as early as 2007 in the U.S. military. Sherri joins me to discuss these threat multipliers, and I ask her questions like, how long has the military known about climate change? What happens when a military and an administration disagree on what action should be taken? Can we run a military on renewable energy? Is the military fundamentally unsustainable? And what good is decarbonising military bases when we're not taking into consideration the geopolitical, economic, and extractive policies that create the conditions for violence and military intervention? I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Sherri, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is such a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Rachel.
Why is the world in crisis?
Okay, well, the world is in crisis, in my view, for really three main reasons. One, it's the rise of authoritarian regimes around the world, particularly in long-standing democracies. Two, it's aggressive conflicts in many regions of the world, violence erupting in many regions at the same time. And third, and what we're going to talk about today, Rachel, is the climate crisis, which is making all of that worse. That's the type of crisis we didn't have. We've had all the others in the past, and they continue with varying degrees of severity across history. What we did not previously have historically was a disrupted natural earth system that is fueling and making all the other crises we face even worse.
Thank you for that very succinct answer. We're going to go straight into the climate crisis, but I just want to have a little addendum and get your opinion on something. What do you think is the role of the economic system in these crises? Extracting resources, extracting from people, increasing inequalities?
Well, the ideal role of the economic system is to lift people out of poverty and enable people to gain the fruits of their labor and lead successful lives. in fact, more people have been lifted out of poverty in my lifetime than before. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it's quite unevenly distributed. So there still are many people in poverty, and the climate crisis sort of exacerbates the haves and the have-nots in that. A well-functioning market-based system with proper regulation and controls on so that natural resources and other resources are not overly exploited can lead to sustainable economic development, but we often see a lot of distortion.
Thank you for that. So the climate crisis, this is something I have found totally fascinating in doing this work and, meeting people at conference and speaking to scientists and hearing the whispers that the militaries around the world are extremely worried about the climate crisis and have been looking at this crisis for a long time. And yet there seems to be a kind of disconnect between what militaries are doing and then what governments are doing, which is typically, if I may, ignoring the crisis at every opportunity. So when did this first come on the military's radar, say in the United States, the climate crisis, and what steps are being taken to research and begin to mitigate against?
Well, Rachel, thank you for that. So, in the U.S. militaries and in the U.K., I would say, and in some other governments, there's a long tradition of understanding and being deep into research and science and research, because that's how we make decisions about technology. That's how we make decisions about military operations and weapon systems. So it's embedded to understand the science. And weather, for example, has always been a critical part of military operations. Think back to the D-Day decision to land in Normandy, which was determined highly which date that would occur, what date in June it would occur was determined very much by British meteorologists watching for signs of changing weather and an opening for clear skies on that particular day. So weather has always been part of it, but understanding how broader climate changes occur, research started to occur, I'd say, in the 70s and in 80s, but really not receiving much public attention. And it wasn't until I organized the first group of generals and admirals in 2007 to assess the national security implications of climate change that there became a dedicated focus on climate change as a threat multiplier. That was the term I coined with the CNA Military Advisory Board in the report we released in 2007. And that led to changes in law in the United States and comparable changes in the UK, which was already proceeding on its own independent path. In fact, our group of generals and admirals, Americans, came to the UK in 2006 to learn what the UK was doing at that time, from the Met Office to the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Ministry and others. And in understanding that an increasingly disrupted natural system, Earth system, with higher temperatures, rising sea levels, prolonged droughts, wildfires, increased storm intensity, would change the world as we know it, we began to require in the U.S. and in some other NATO countries in particular, that we assess those security implications of climate change on a regular basis and integrate it into our national security strategy and our defense strategy. And so that has been proceeding with varying degrees of robustness, let's say, since that time. And, the militaries don't have, they can't wait until, as we said in that report, you don't wait until you have 100% certainty. In other words, you don't wait until the Soviet Union is about to launch a nuclear attack on the United States and annihilate the planet. You don't wait until the terrorist is about to strike. You don't wait for the next cyber attack. if you wait for 100% certainty, something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. That was what General Gordon Sullivan, the former U.S. Army Chief of Staff and chairman of the first CNA Military Advisory Board said. And that's why as we learn more about how the climate is changing, how risks are accelerating, it's basically a risk management problem for the military. It's got to manage across a range of risks, whatever risks there are: cyber, terrorism, strategic competition, and now climate.
I want to get into the implications for national security and defense and some of the strategies that are being rolled out. But before we do that, I'm so aware, and I mean, everybody in the world is so aware that the American administrations are swinging wildly at the moment between two very different ideologies. And so I'm curious about the fact that in government, there are these sort of like long-standing civil servants. So civil servants that will be around no matter the administration. They have to work for whatever administration comes in. And similarly with the military is there no matter what. And so what happens if the military, which has been gathering data on a problem for decades, understands a problem, has strategies, what happens when their opinion about what should be done conflicts with an administration's opinion about the very existence of that problem?
That is a great question. And there are various ways in which that is managed. In the least harmful way, sometimes the framing is, the issue is reframed to, let's say, disruptive weather and water event instead of using the word climate. But in fact, even during the years of President Trump, the U.S. military, the U.S. Department of Defense developed something called the Defense Climate Assessment Tool because it knew that military infrastructure was being damaged and suffering from sea level rise, extreme storms, floods, and there needed to be a way to assess the climate risks to infrastructure and then make responsible decisions if you're going to build something or you're going to rehab, restore a base, what's the right standard? Okay. So that work went on and now it's widely deployed. In the U.S., in fact, we even share this defense climate assessment tool with some of our allies. So, that work continues. Sometimes there is, because this area had become political in the United, there could be a slowdown in the acceleration through the energy transition to more sustainable energy sources that also provide the military today improved effectiveness. For example, as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, has said, hybrid electric vehicles for the Army and on the battlefield actually are quieter and they have better torque. So there's a military advantage to the energy transition to electrify in certain cases. Every case is specific. But if you slow down those changes because it's politicized, then you could leave the military less ready, less capable of engaging in the next contested battlefield. And oh, by the way, let's be very clear that our adversaries, such as China, for example, they're fully aware of the climate risks that they face. They're incorporating it into their defense strategies. They're planning for it in how they might undertake a military operation or an aggression against Taiwan. So we have to be very clear-eyed about the risks.
What are some of the national security implications due to climate change, and what are some of the strategies that are being implemented?
Well, Thank you, Rachel. So as I spell out in my book, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, the implications of climate change for our security range from the strategic to the operational and tactical. So let's talk about each of those. It is changing where and how we need our military forces around the world today. So, for example, in our lifetime, we've had a new open Arctic Ocean that didn't exist several decades ago because we have rising temperatures 4 times global average, plus retreating sea ice and thawing and collapsing permafrost. President Putin sees the northern sea route that hugs the Arctic coastline as a toll road for future transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. And oh, by the way, China is eyeing the Arctic, declares itself to be a near Arctic stakeholder, and in the future would like to make use of shorter shipping lanes across the Arctic, extract the energy and minerals, and in the future, fish, as fish stocks move to both poles with warmer waters and continued and rampant illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in many parts of the world, fish being a primary and growing food source. So that is one way in which climate is affecting our strategic competition. Elsewhere around the world, because of increased storm intensity in every country and wildfires and sometimes flooding, we see our military forces increasingly responding as backup to your civilian first responders. So in the U.S., 2 firefighters in the wake of the recent Hurricane Helene to the National Guard to help provide search and rescue to support the local search and rescue teams, also to provide water. So increasingly, our military is doing what we call humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief all around the world in Poland, in the wake of recent floods, in Portugal, in the wake of recent fires. It's the militaries who have that backup capability to help support those in need. And it's a wonderful thing that they have that, but that's not initially what they've been designed to do, right? So that's how another way in which this is changing how our militaries operate today. And then we see that they are on the front lines of a changing climate. So troops have to deploy today in hotter temperatures or colder temperatures in the Arctic. They're subject to increased disease, or sometimes it's too hot to train. We call it black flag days. And increasingly in the South and Southwest United States, we have temperatures above 95 Fahrenheit with wet bulb temperatures that make it unsafe for our troops to train. And that's going to be the same with deployments around the world. So we see at every level of the strategic, the operational, how our forces are going to use their weapon systems, the salinity of the oceans is changing. That changes how ships operate. As temperatures are higher, it changes the lift for aircraft. So in every way, a changing climate affects how our forces both protect us and how they operate.
This is fascinating. It's fascinating to hear an industry have such an acute understanding of how they will be impacted when ordinarily you go to conferences and industries don't have a particularly good idea of how they will be impacted. I wonder, this is something that you hear, that I've heard sometimes, something that I've repeated off air. I don't think I've ever said it on air. But there is a question as to whether or not a military can run on renewable energy, is there not? Because of the huge amount of emissions currently that are sort of spewed out by jet fuel. The United States military's emissions annually are equal to the country of Sweden. So when you take away this capacity to go very far, very quickly in the air, and other things like having to do ground invasions without any electricity, to charge up batteries on zero carbon emissions, all of that. Is there a world in which you can have a fully functioning military on a renewable energy system, or would the function of the military have to change with the energy system?
I would reframe your question, Rachel, to say that we can move to decarbonize our military and our societies, and we can move to net zero. In the U.S., the Department of Defense has ambitious goals to be net zero by 2050 and net zero on electricity by 2035. And it's achieving that first at military bases. So let me step back for a minute. Yes, militaries are large users of energy. In the U.S., the military is about 1% of total energy use, and about 2/3 of that is for the operational uses of aircraft, ships, and tanks, and most of that is in aircraft, and another third is in what we call the bases and station installations. So, the first opportunity to decarbonize is really at our military bases, and there are multiple purposes to do it. It's not only about being green and responding to the climate crisis, but it's also about having energy security, because we have an increasingly fragile national grid. And when that grid goes down in a storm or from a cyber or another deliberate attack, the military still has to be able to operate. It has a requirement in the U.S. that bases have to be able to operate for 14 days, 2 weeks, without being connected to the national grid. So how is it doing that? Today, it's deploying microgrids on most major military bases. And that microgrid enables you to put distributed energy resources on it. So at the first net zero military base in the U.S., which is in Albany, Georgia, it's a Marine Corps base, Albany, Georgia, they put on their microgrid a waste to energy plant. They're actually extracting methane from an old landfill and using that to convert that waste to energy. They have other sources too. Now, and you could put renewables on there. And of course you could put your propane tank on there. So, I mean, it's an opportunity to have energy security and affect the transition responsibly to decarbonized energy source. For our aircraft, which are the major users of fossil fuels, one, there are several things you could do. One is we work to develop sustainable aviation fuels. That really is going to be led by the commercial aviation industry, which is a much bigger user of aviation fuel than the military worldwide. So it's their innovation and R&D that the Department of Defense and other militaries can be part of and benefit from that transition to sustainable aviation. That's one. Second, it's new designs of weapon systems that are themselves more efficient. We used to think, when I started out in this field, it was an ironclad rule that to have a more powerful or more effective weapon system, you're going to have more energy, and that meant more fossil energy, more gas. Think of the Abrams tank that gets 2 gallons per mile. But that Gordian knot has been broken now in a beneficial way. So now we see that there are benefits to being relying on less energy, and you can get improved military performance. So, for example, today we have a new aircraft design called the blended body wing, which is going to be 30% more efficient and more effective, and have less aerodynamic drag, even on existing fuels. So there are benefits in efficiency and new designs. And then thirdly, I would say the militaries are working to advance the kinds of innovations they will need to operate in what we call a contested battlefield. In other words, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned the hard way that our forces were subject to improvised explosive device attacks as they were trucking fuel to the front. And 8 out of 10 of the convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan were trucking fuel and water to the front. And that was putting soldiers and Marines' lives at risk. So we look for ways to reduce those long logistics supply chains, either by better batteries, by alternative fuels, by using renewables to power remote military bases. So all of those innovations, which started for the purpose of unleashing us from the tether of fuel, back over 10 years ago are now advancing and being also understood in the context of future war fights, perhaps in a maritime domain in the Asia Pacific. Instead of a land war, it might be a maritime domain, but you still need to refuel your non-nuclear powered ships and your aircraft. So, for example, you need to think about long duration storage. You need to think about ways of having blended fuel mixes. So there are a lot of innovations in the mix today.
I want to ask a slightly different timbre of question, maybe, than you're used to receiving. Are we not getting to a stage where the pursuit of war is fundamentally unsustainable when we have weapons that could destroy nations, destroy cultures, destroy even the world? It does seem that the planet being on the brink of a disaster from over-extraction, along with the vast majority of human innovation seemingly put towards things that are capable of huge destruction, there must be an end point to this, surely. There must be a point where we begin to repurpose what a military is for, not for war, but for humanitarian assistance all the time. And I say that because it's something I'm deeply worried about, is as resources become more scarce, and as the need for collaboration becomes greater, in fact, what we will see is increasing conflict, because that is what tends to happen when resources go scarce. We can't seem to get through this without doing it together. And yet we still live in a world of adversaries and huge military output and military dominance. Is a truly sustainable world one in which has no militaries, perhaps?
Well, that would be ideal, but I don't see that happening in either of our lifetimes. And if you look historically, there's not really any precedent for that. But on the other hand, I do think that, militaries are trained, the best militaries, for example, in the U.S., UK, many of our NATO allies and other countries around the world are trained at the heart to be peace builders. And really they are used in that way oftentimes during times of peace for engagement. And we see that now around the world. Today, the militaries aren't the solution to the climate crisis, because that has to happen in the civilian world, and militaries should be part of that. But as we improve our development and our diplomacy and our climate finance and the other tools that we have to address the challenges of the climate crisis, militaries should be in there in a responsible supporting role. I would that we could get rid of the conflicts we face around the world today, from Ukraine to the Middle East to the tensions we face in the Asia Pacific and every region of the world. But unfortunately, I'm not that sanguine. I like to say I'm like Madeleine Albright. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. But I am hopeful for our future. I want my kids to have a peaceful future. But look, my parents were Holocaust refugees. I am, I exist because my parents were among the fortunate few who were able to escape Nazi Germany. So, I think that is, we always have to be concerned that there are threats and challenges around the corner. And that's why we have to be prepared. We can work to build a better day. That's what my faith teaches us. We need to kun along. We need to help create a better future. That's why I'm in the field I'm in, because I wanted to, in my earliest years, growing up in the Cold War, work on the biggest challenges of the day. And at that time, it was a potential Soviet nuclear attack against the United States. It was the nuclear age. And so I started out working in that field. And we were fortunate that the Cold War ended peaceably. And then, as I say, my career went from weapons to waste at the end of that, as we didn't need to produce nuclear weapons and the fissile materials anymore. And I was tasked with actually helping to clean up the nuclear weapons complex. And then in the Department of Defense later to help provide in the first era of really environmental security in the U.S. Department of Defense. So I am hopeful that we can understand and build climate awareness across our societies. I think we still, unfortunately, will, at the end of the day, live in a world where we have to be prepared for armed conflict, and we do the best we can. We can reduce that spectrum of violence by improving sustainable outcomes for people at local levels around the world.
It's quite hard to hear that military is often used in peace-building missions when we live in a world where currently there is a genocide going on in Gaza, there is a genocide going on in West Papua, there is a genocide going on in Sudan. And these militarized conflicts against indigenous groups of people are often being driven by resource grabs and resource extraction. If we look at the United States military interventions in the Middle East and the British military intervention in the Middle East, we have it on record now that before those interventions, military interventions were signed off. There was huge, there were meetings about to establish how much oil was available in Iraq and how it would be divvied up after the war. And so when there seems to be this relationship between using militaries to extract resources, is there a kind of fallacy in trying to decarbonize military bases, but we're not actually taking the steps to, there's no verb for this, but de-violence the very systems within which we exist that would mitigate our need for such defensive systems against potential aggression and attacks in the future?
Well, Rachel, speaking to you today on October 7th, the anniversary of the deadliest attack against the state of Israel, with hostages still being held, I just want to set the record straight that that was the deadliest attack against free democratic state. Still have violence being perpetrated against the people of Israel and hostages being held. So I think you and I maybe have a different view of what's going on in that region now. That said, I do think that, and for example, I received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association this last year. And that's because through my career working in and out of the U.S. government, I have worked to find those opportunities to understand where resource scarcity is causing stress and work to provide those solutions to it in an integrated way that can involve both local, of course, the local citizens and groups that are affected, but also involves our diplomatic, our development, and where necessary, our defense. You have to have security in order to be able to secure your resources. And it's the stress that is occurring today particularly in drought-stricken regions across the Middle East and North Africa, where farmers and herders and fishers in the past lived peaceably in an area, and there is now not sufficient water or topsoil to support their traditional livelihoods. And then they find themselves being recruited by terrorists who are the ones who are controlling the resources and extracting them. So I think that is a situation where we have a world in which we have states, fragile states, weak governance that has allowed non-state actors like terrorists to particularly disrupt the lives and livelihoods and take advantage of the climate crisis to make lives worse for people in many parts of the world.
I think you're talking about the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, and they are a non-state actor.
ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world, okay, where we stand for, democracy in Ukraine. I mean, that conflict is, of course, devastating, and the landmines and the destruction is devastating. But would it be better to not have a free Ukraine? I don't think so. I think, unfortunately, wars are destructive. And we have values.
Sorry, I don't mean not. I don't mean not defending oneself against aggression by any means. I suppose what I'm saying is the bigger picture of all of the preceding decisions and actions and economic systems and policies that create these systems of conflict and violence. Like if we look at, as you just said, topsoil erosion and water droughts being caused by the climate crisis that are now causing that. This seems like a very simple, not simple, but this seems like something that we can track. Whereas in lots of other conflicts around the world, it's quite difficult, seemingly, to ask people to track back in time the things that led up to military interventions, for example. Like in West Papua, the West Papuan freedom fighters will often talk about the fight between capitalism and communism, essentially in the 60s and 70s, and point to that as the fight that led to their being enslaved, essentially, by the Indonesian military.
Well, I'd be happy to continue discussing how we can use the opportunities we have to move to more sustainability as a way to improve our planet, which is, I think, the focus of your work.
The focus of my work are the systems that are driving the world in crisis, which is also the political, economic, and historical decisions that have led us here today. And so I don't...
We have to start from a place. We start from this place. So we start from where we are today. Yes, if we could correct all the historical ills, yes, then maybe the Holocaust would not have happened and 6 million would have died. But that did happen. So, we are where we are today. And I think that as we look forward, we want to, use our capabilities in a way that advances sustainability and a better life for all.
Well, on that we can absolutely agree. Sherri, I'm aware that unfortunately we've run out of time. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Well, thank you so much for that, Rachel. I would like to platform, as you say, my colleague and dear friend, Alice Hill, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And she's also just finished a very important piece of work on how climate change affects voting around the world.
Oh, interesting.
Really interesting. And she did a very, a multi-country examination with a colleague, and they've put out a very good piece of research in a number of places, including the Council on Foreign Relations and in other areas. And Alice Hill, I think, would be a terrific contributor to your program.
Brilliant. Well, I still look forward to speaking with her. Thank you so much, Sherri, for your time today.
Thank you, Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.